I was always the golden daughter. The one who followed the rules, got straight A's, stayed quiet during family fights, and smiled through dinners even when the room was full of tension. My father, William Hartman, ran our house like a business, strict, cold, and always demanding results. And for most of my life, I gave him exactly what he wanted. I dressed like he liked, went to the college he chose, and even turned down jobs he didn't approve of. My mother just went along with it. Her eyes always flicked nervously between us, like she was watching a storm gather in the distance, but never dared to raise a warning. Then came Jason. He wasn't rich. He didn't have a fancy degree. He didn't drive a European car or wear a wristwatch that cost more than a month's rent. But he had something my father never valued: kindness. The first time Jason met my parents, my father stared at him with the same expression he gave to burned toast. He didn't even try to hide his disgust. "A mechanic?" he said afterward, as if I had just announced I was marrying a stray dog. My mother stayed silent, as usual. I had hoped for even a soft nudge of support from her, but she just offered a weak smile and said, "Your father only wants what's best for you." I had heard that line so many times, it had lost all meaning. Jason didn't care. He knew he wasn't what they expected, but he also believed that love was stronger than pride. We got married quietly, no big ceremony. Just a small gathering at the courthouse with a few friends. No one from my family came. My mother didn't even send a message. My father sent an envelope with nothing inside. Not a card. Not a word. Just an empty envelope like a hollow slap to the face. For the first few months, we were happy. We didn't have much. Our apartment was tiny, and Jason worked long hours at the auto shop, but it was peaceful. He made dinner every night, sometimes burning it, but always laughing about it. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. Like I wasn't walking on glass. But peace doesn't last when you're still tethered to a family that believes you betrayed them. I found out later that my father had told relatives I had thrown my future away for a garage rat. That I had been brainwashed by a loser. Every family gathering I was excluded from, every wedding or baby shower I wasn't invited to, it all added up like silent punishments. I was being erased. Then 6 months after the wedding, I got the call. It was my mother. She rarely called, so when I saw her name light up my phone, I hesitated before answering. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge under every word. "Your father wants you to come by," she said. "He has something to discuss." I should have said no. I should have just let the silence continue. But a part of me, small, desperate, still craving some sliver of acceptance, said yes. Jason offered to drive me, but I told him I'd be fine. That was a mistake. When I walked into the house I grew up in, everything felt smaller, colder. My father was already sitting in the living room, the same spot he always occupied like a throne. He didn't get up. He didn't smile. He just stared at me with that familiar disappointment. He told me I had embarrassed the family, that I had ruined my future. And then he said the words that I would never forget. "You're not welcome here anymore." No apology, no regret. Just that. I stood there, stunned, my coat still half on. I looked at my mother, hoping, begging for her to say something. But she turned away, as if avoiding eye contact could erase me entirely. I left the house in a daze. I walked 2 blocks before I even remembered to call Jason. He picked up on the first ring, and as soon as I heard his voice, I broke. The tears came all at once, choking me, burning my throat. He didn't ask questions. He just said he was on his way. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jason held me, but my thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. The pain wasn't just from being disowned. It was from the realization that I had spent my whole life earning the love of people who never really gave it freely. I had been a transaction, a project, a reflection of my father's pride until I stopped being convenient. The next day, I moved through our apartment like a ghost. Jason went to work, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the bed. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the coldness in my father's voice, the way my mother looked at the floor. It all felt surreal. But something changed in me that day. Something hardened. The girl who once tried so hard to please, to obey, To be accepted, she was gone. Over the next few months, I poured myself into work. I picked up freelance projects, ran errands for neighbors, and even started an online store selling handmade crafts I used to only make as a hobby. Jason worked harder, too. He started offering at-home repairs, helping elderly clients for almost nothing just because he couldn't say no. Our savings began to grow, dollar by careful dollar. Then, one evening as we were walking back from the corner store, Jason stopped in his tracks. Across the street was a for sale sign in front of a familiar brick house. My parents' house. My chest tightened. The lawn was overgrown, the curtains drawn. It looked tired, worn out. Jason glanced at me and said nothing. We just stood there in the fading sunlight, watching the wind rustle the sign like it was daring us. I found out later they were in deep debt. My father had lost a major client at his firm, and with no savings and no support system, the bills had piled up fast. My mother had started borrowing money from distant cousins. It wasn't long before the bank stepped in. The house was on the market, and I wasn't supposed to know. But I knew. And so did Jason. He didn't say much the next few days, but I could see the gears turning in his head. Something was brewing. He started making phone calls, setting up meetings. He worked late into the night on his laptop, muttering numbers under his breath. I didn't ask questions. I trusted him. Then, one morning over breakfast, he looked up at me and simply said, "We're going to buy it." It didn't take long before Jason's plan began to take shape. Over the next few weeks, we didn't just sit idly by while my parents' world crumbled. Jason had been quietly working behind the scenes, reaching out to mortgage lenders, reviewing the property value, and making strategic decisions. As we spent our nights drafting plans and figuring out how to finance such a big move, my mind wrestled with the idea of actually going through with it. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about paying off a house. It was about taking control of my past, of a life I'd allowed to be dictated by people who never saw me for who I truly was. Jason had always been the kind of person who believed in redemption, in second chances. But for me, this was more than just helping my husband secure a business deal. This was personal. It was a statement. It was the last piece in a long chain of decisions that had started when my father turned me away on that night, on my birthday. What better way to end the story of my subjugation than to own the very house they had once made me feel so small in? To turn their rejection into a declaration of power. The bank accepted Jason's offer on the property, and the process moved quickly. My hands trembled as I signed the paperwork, but there was no hesitation in my heart. We were doing this. And just like that, the house, my parents' home, was ours. But the real twist came a few weeks later. Jason and I had decided to keep the acquisition under wraps for now, letting everything fall into place before we told anyone, especially my parents. I had yet to make contact with them, and part of me wondered if I ever would. Jason was adamant about letting it play out naturally, without any fanfare. His belief was that this wasn't about gloating. It was about showing them that I had built something of my own, independent of their control. So, we kept our silence, letting the house sit empty for a few days as we prepared for the next steps. Then, one cold morning in late November, the silence was broken. I had just gotten out of bed when I saw Jason pacing in the living room, his phone glued to his ear. His face was pale, a sign that something had shifted. He ended the call with a frustrated sigh and turned toward me, eyes narrowed with a mix of determination and something else, something I couldn't quite read. He told me that my father had been by the property. He had tried to access the house, and when he found the locks had been changed, he'd gotten into his car and driven off without even bothering to knock. Something in me snapped. I hadn't seen him since that night, but now the anger I thought had subsided flooded back in waves. This was it, the last straw. The audacity of it. He had no idea who had bought the house, but he was already planning his next move, convinced that it should be his. Jason watched me for a long moment, waiting for me to speak, but I was lost in my thoughts. I wasn't going to sit idly by and let this slide. I wasn't the same person who had left the house a few months ago, heartbroken and crushed. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my life. I decided that it was time to confront my parents in a way they never expected. I had kept quiet, let them pretend I was disposable, but now the situation was different. I had built something real, something they would never be able to take from me. The house, the one they had forced me to leave, was now mine, and it would be the stage for my comeback. But I couldn't just let it end there. I wasn't interested in just winning the property. I wanted to make sure they understood the cost of their cruelty. Jason agreed, without hesitation. We didn't need to rush this. It would happen on our terms, but we needed the right moment. We started making plans. I reached out to a few people I still had ties with in town, people who had witnessed everything, who knew the truth about the sacrifices I had made for my family. The support, while not overwhelming, was enough. Enough to know that when the time came, I wouldn't be alone in this fight. The first major shift came when my father tried to use the house as leverage. He began calling local real estate agents, trying to find out who had bought the house. I don't know if it was out of desperation or pride, but he was determined to find a way to make me regret my decision. As each day passed, I could feel the weight of my past loosening its grip on me. The house wasn't just a structure anymore, it had become a symbol. A symbol of breaking free from the chains of familial obligation. Every time my father tried to assert control, it felt less effective. He was no longer the person whose approval I craved. He was just a man fighting to hold on to a life that no longer included me. Then came the day we finally told them. It wasn't a confrontation like I had imagined. I didn't want to cause a scene. Instead, I simply walked up to the front door of their house, the one that had once been mine, and rang the bell. I had already informed them of the change, but this time I was going to deliver it in person. My father opened the door, his face falling when he saw me standing there with Jason behind me. I had expected something: anger, disbelief, perhaps even an apology. But he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I didn't give him a chance to speak. I told him everything, calmly, methodically. How the house was mine now. How the very thing he thought he could control, our family's home, was in the hands of someone else. Someone who, unlike him, had never used me. I told him that I had grown tired of being the person they could manipulate, the one who cleaned up their messes, paid their bills, and stayed silent when they ignored my worth. I wasn't his to control anymore. I wasn't anyone's to control. When I finished, I didn't wait for a response. I simply turned and walked away, knowing full well that the power had shifted. For the first time, I felt free. Free from the expectations, free from the guilt, and free from the family who had tried to make me believe I was nothing without them. As Jason and I drove away, I knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about a house. It was about taking control of my life, of my destiny. And the best part? My parents wouldn't even see it coming. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and quiet determination. I didn't expect an immediate response from my parents, and for the first time, that felt liberating. The decision had been made, and the ball was in their court. Jason and I returned to our daily routines, but there was a subtle shift. The tension that had been building for years had finally started to dissipate. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else's approval or validation. It was strange, this feeling of freedom. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost foreign, like I had been wearing someone else's clothes all my life and had just now peeled them off. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to embrace it. I was no longer tethered to the expectations of my family. I had done the hard work to get here, not just financially, but emotionally. I had learned that I wasn't a placeholder in their lives. I wasn't someone to be used until I had nothing left to give. Then came the message. It was unexpected, but in hindsight, I should have known it was coming. The message arrived from an old family friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She had been at the town's fall festival and had overheard something that sent a chill down her spine. My father had been spreading lies, telling everyone that I had abandoned him and my mother for no good reason. He painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had left them when they needed me most. But what struck her, and what made her reach out to me, was the fact that he was telling people the story with such confidence. He had framed the narrative in a way that made him look like the victim, while I was the villain, the one who had walked away without a care. I didn't respond right away. Jason and I discussed it, weighing our options. We both agreed that I had already said my piece. I had already given them the chance to acknowledge the sacrifices I made, but instead, they had chosen to erase me from their lives. What was left to say? Still, something gnawed at me. It wasn't guilt. It was a sense of unfinished business. My father's lies couldn't stand. Not because I needed his approval, but because I knew the truth, and I had to set it free. Over the next few days, I gathered everything. All the receipts, the bank statements, the emails, the text messages, every scrap of evidence that painted a different picture from the one my father was telling. I compiled a timeline of everything I had done, from paying their utility bills when they couldn't, to repairing their roof during a torrential downpour, to cleaning up their messes over and over again. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clearing my name, about making sure the truth was told. I had spent years living in the shadow of their neglect, and it was time to step into the light. Jason was fully on board. He knew how hard this would be for me, but he also understood the weight of it. He had seen the emotional toll it had taken on me, and he didn't want me to carry that burden any longer. Together, we crafted a post. A simple one, but one that would speak volumes. We posted everything: screenshots of payments, messages, bills, repairs, and more. There was no emotion, no anger in the words, just cold, hard facts. The truth had a power that lies could never replicate. We posted it and waited. It didn't take long for the reaction to come. At first, it was just a few messages from friends and distant relatives who had seen the post. They offered their support, even though some of them were too afraid to speak out before. Slowly, the momentum grew. People who had known me as the obedient daughter, the one who always tried to do the right thing, started sharing the post. It spread through the small town like wildfire. Neighbors, former teachers, even people who had never met me but had seen the cracks in my family's facade began to chime in. The truth was spreading faster than I could have ever imagined. As the post gained traction, I could feel a sense of justice rising in me. It wasn't about hurting my parents, it was about reclaiming my story. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the one who had been used, neglected, and pushed aside. They had tried to erase me, but now I was taking back control. The more people shared it, the more my father and mother's lies started to unravel. It wasn't long before the whispers of doubt began to creep into the town. My father's story was no longer as solid as he had hoped. People had seen more than they let on, and now they were starting to speak out. But the real twist came when my father attempted to retaliate. He posted a response, trying to salvage his reputation, but it only made things worse. His post was filled with half-truths and manipulation, but it was too late. The damage had been done. People weren't buying it anymore. They remembered the times I had stayed late at work to help with repairs, the times I had dipped into my savings to pay off bills. They remembered the daughter who had quietly held everything together while my parents struggled. Now they saw the truth. They saw the daughter who had finally walked away, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Jason and I stayed out of it for the most part. We let the post speak for itself. But we couldn't ignore the emails and messages from old friends, some of whom were surprised by what they had learned. Some of them apologized for not seeing it sooner, for not speaking out when they had seen the cracks in my family's armor. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also validating. For once, I wasn't the one being painted as the problem. I was the one who had taken control of her life, who had broken free. I continued to receive messages from my parents, but I ignored them. They were desperate, pleading for me to come back, to fix things. But I had already done enough. The only thing left for me to do now was move forward. The house was mine, the past was behind me, and I was free. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their love if it came with strings attached. Days turned into weeks, and Jason and I continued with our lives. The town's reaction had shifted from sympathy for my parents to an understanding of my struggle. People who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly about the years of manipulation and emotional abuse I had endured. And while it wasn't easy, I knew that the worst was behind me. My parents were no longer the center of my world. I had finally learned how to stand on my own, to choose myself, to live for me. It wasn't a storybook ending, but it was mine, and it was enough.